I never believed in curses until the night of my grandmother's funeral. The old woman had always been strange, muttering in Portuguese under her breath, crossing herself whenever I entered a room. My mother said it was just her way, that growing up in rural Brazil had made her superstitious before immigrating to Massachusetts. But there was something in her eyes when she looked at me, something that went beyond mere disapproval. The funeral was held on a humid August evening. The chapel smelled of lilies and incense, a combination that made my stomach turn. As I stood before her open casket, I noticed something odd. Her fingers were positioned strangely, crossed in a way that seemed unnatural, almost as if she were still trying to ward something off even in death. That night, I returned to my apartment in Boston's North End. The city lights flickered through my window as I tried to sleep, but exhaustion wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying memories of my grandmother. She had immigrated to America in the 1960s, settling in the Portuguese community, bringing with her traditions and beliefs that seemed ancient even then. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it for the first time, a scratching sound, soft and rhythmic, coming from my bedroom wall. I told myself it was rats, or the old building settling, but the sound had a deliberate quality that made my skin crawl. It moved slowly from one side of the wall to the other, as if something were tracing a path through the plaster. The scratching stopped as suddenly as it began. In the silence that followed, I heard breathing. Not my own. This was deeper, more labored, like someone struggling to draw air through damaged lungs. It came from the corner of my room, near the closet. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and swept it across the darkness. Nothing. The corner was empty. Sleep didn't come that night. When dawn finally broke, I convinced myself it had been a dream, a manifestation of grief and exhaustion. I went about my day, grabbing coffee, heading to work, pretending everything was normal. But Norma was already slipping away from me, like sand through desperate fingers. The second night was worse. I woke to the sensation of weight on my chest, as if someone were sitting on me. My eyes flew open, but I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Sleep paralysis, I thought frantically. Just sleep paralysis. Then I saw her. My grandmother stood at the foot of my bed, but this wasn't the frail old woman I'd buried yesterday. Her form was wrong, distorted. She was too tall, her limbs stretched and angular. Her face bore her features, but twisted, as if seen through warped glass. Her eyes were completely black, reflecting no light. Her mouth opened impossibly wide, and from it came a sound I'll never forget. A low, grinding moan that seemed to vibrate in my bones. When I could finally move, she was gone. I sat up gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every light in my apartment went on. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Instead, I researched, scrolling through articles about grief hallucinations, about carbon monoxide poisoning, about anything that could explain what I'd seen. By the third day, I was exhausted. Dark circles ringed my eyes, and my hands shook from too much caffeine. My coworkers asked if I was okay. I lied and said I was fine, just dealing with family matters. How could I tell them that my dead grandmother was haunting me, that something malevolent was wearing her face like a mask? I called my mother that afternoon. She was still at my grandmother's house, sorting through her belongings. When I told her about the experiences, about the figure I'd seen, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then she spoke in a voice I'd never heard her use before, tight with fear. She told me that my grandmother had been involved in things before she emigrated. Dark things. In her village, people had whispered that she'd made deals with entities that lived in the spaces between the living and the dead. My mother had always dismissed it as rural superstition, but now she wasn't so sure. She said my grandmother had been trying to tell her something before she died. According to my mother, my grandmother kept saying something about a debt, about payment that would come due. She'd been agitated, insistent that certain rituals needed to be performed after her death. But my mother, practical and American-born, had ignored her. Now she was terrified that she'd made a terrible mistake, that something had been left unfinished. That night, I stayed with a friend. I told him I was having issues with my apartment. Didn't want to be alone. He offered me his couch, without question. For a few hours, surrounded by the noise of his TV and the warmth of his company, I almost felt safe. Almost felt like maybe it was all in my head. But at 3:13 a.m., I woke to that same labored breathing. My friend's apartment was dark except for the glow of the cable box. The breathing was coming from the hallway. Slowly, dreading what I'd see, I turned my head toward the sound. She was there, standing in the shadows just beyond the living room. This time, she was closer. Close enough that I could see the wrongness of her in detail. Her skin had a waxy, translucent quality. Her joints bent at angles that shouldn't be possible. When she moved, it was with a jerky, stop-motion quality, as if she were skipping frames in reality itself. And she was smiling with too many teeth in that stretched mouth. I couldn't scream. Fear had locked my throat completely. She began to move toward me, each step accompanied by a wet, crackling sound, like bones breaking and reforming. Her hand reached out, fingers elongated like spider legs. I scrambled back, falling off the couch, and in that moment of panic, I found my voice. Primera, escréame. My friend burst from his bedroom, turning on lights. The figure vanished instantly. He found me on the floor, hyperventilating, unable to form coherent sentences. He wanted to call an ambulance, thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe, primera, maybe this was what madness felt like, creeping in at the edges of perception until it consumed everything. I left before dawn. Couldn't risk bringing whatever this was into my friend's home again. I drove aimlessly as the sun rose, trying to think. My grandmother had been trying to tell my mother something. There were rituals that needed to be performed. If this was real, if something truly had followed me from her funeral, then maybe there was a way to stop it. I went to the Boston Public Library, started researching Brazilian folklore, demonology, anything that might explain what was happening. I learned about entities that fed on family connections, demons that could be bound by blood ties. I read about curses that passed down through generations, waiting for the right moment to manifest. The more I read in those old books and archives, the more convinced I became that my grandmother hadn't been warning me away all those years. She'd been trying to protect me from something she'd brought with her from Brazil. Something that had been waiting, patient and hungry, for her death to release it. And now it wore her face as it hunted me, using her form to get close, to break down my defenses before it struck. But what did it want? What was the debt my grandmother owed? I found my answer in an old journal entry on an obscure blog about Brazilian folk magic. It described a practice where desperate people would make pacts with entities called os devoradores. These beings would grant favors, but the price was always the same. When you died, they would claim someone in your bloodline, usually the youngest, and consume them slowly over 7 nights. 7 nights, I counted back. The funeral was 4 days ago. I'd already endured 4 nights of this horror. That meant I had 3 nights left before whatever this thing truly was revealed its full nature. 3 nights before it stopped playing with its food and actually fed. The realization hit me like ice water in my veins. I needed help. Real help. I started calling local practitioners, anyone who advertised spiritual services. Most were charlatans. I could tell immediately. They spoke in vague generalities, offered expensive cleansing packages. But one woman, a practitioner of Cannonball, listened to my story in silence. When I finished, she asked me a single question. Did my grandmother have any personal items buried with her? I didn't know. I called my mother again, asked her about the burial. She confirmed what I feared. At my grandmother's insistence, she'd been buried with several items: a small leather pouch, a wooden box with strange carvings, and a locked metal tin that no one had been able to open. These items, the practitioner told me, were likely the anchors, the physical objects binding the entity to our family. The practitioner explained that I had 2 choices. I could try to appease the entity, offer it something else in exchange for my freedom, or I could break the binding entirely by destroying the anchors. The first option would only delay the inevitable, passing the curse to another generation. The second was dangerous, potentially fatal if done incorrectly, but it was the only way to truly end this. That night, the 5th night, I didn't go home. Instead, I went to the cemetery with a shovel. It was madness, illegal, probably impossible, but desperation makes you capable of things you never imagined. The cemetery was closed, surrounded by a fence. I climbed it, dropping into darkness on the other side. My heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Finding a grave in the dark was harder than I expected. Row after row of headstones, all looking the same in the moonlight. When I finally found it, fresh dirt still mounded over the plot, I stood there with the shovel, knowing this was the point of no return. Once I started digging, there would be no going back. I'd be committed to this insane course of action. I dug. The sound of the shovel biting into earth seemed impossibly loud in the quiet cemetery. Every few minutes I'd stop, listening for security guards or police, but the only sound was my own ragged breathing and the whisper of wind through the trees. Deeper and deeper, my muscles burning, my hands blistering despite the gloves I wore. Oars. Passed. Sweat soaked through my clothes. My back screamed in agony. But finally, the shovel struck wood. The coffin. I cleared the dirt from the top, my hands shaking. This was desecration, violation of everything I'd been raised to respect. But it was also survival. Whatever my grandmother had unleashed, I had to stop it. I pried open the coffin lid, half expecting her corpse to surge up and grab me. But she lay there peacefully, hands still crossed over her chest in that strange pattern. I could see the leather pouch tucked beside her, the wooden box near her feet, the metal tin in her hands. I reached in, my stomach churning with revulsion and fear. The moment my fingers touched the leather pouch, the temperature plummeted. My breath turned to fog. The wind that had been a whisper became a howl, and then she was there, the twisted version of my grandmother, rising from the trees like smoke made solid. But this time she wasn't silent. She screamed, a sound of such rage and hunger that it drove me to my knees. I grabbed all three items, clutching them to my chest as I scrambled out of the grave. The entity advanced, no longer even trying to maintain a human shape. It was a mass of shadows and eyes, with my grandmother's face floating in the center like a drowning person under ice. I ran, stumbling through the cemetery, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. The practitioner had given me specific instructions. The items needed to be destroyed by fire, but not ordinary fire. I had to use flame that had been blessed, purified. I prepared everything in advance. A metal drum behind an abandoned building where I'd conducted the ritual. Salt circle, drawn, protective prayers written on paper and tucked in my pockets. Maches, blessed by the practitioner herself. I made it to the drum, threw the items inside. The entity was right behind me, close enough that I could feel the unnatural cold radiating from it. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the matches. The first one wouldn't light, neither would the second. The thing was reaching for me, those elongated fingers stretching toward my throat. The third match caught. I dropped it into the drum. The flame that erupted wasn't normal. It burned blue and white, intense enough that I had to shield my face. The entity shrieked, a sound that shattered the windows of nearby buildings. The leather pouch ignited first, releasing the smell of rot and sulfur. The wooden box followed, burning with an intensity that shouldn't have been possible for aged wood. But the metal tin wouldn't catch. The fire licked at it, but it remained intact. The entity was being pulled toward the drum, drawn by the destruction of the anchors, but it wasn't disappearing. It fought, clawing at the air, at reality itself. I realized with horror that the tin was the primary anchor, the one that truly mattered, and it was locked, protecting its contents from the flame. I grabbed a piece of rebar from the ground, used it to pry at the tin, even as the heat from the fire burned my skin. The entity's screams were inside my head now, promising torture, promising an eternity of suffering. The tin buckled. One more strike. The lid popped open. Inside was a photograph, yellowed with age, and a small vial of dark liquid. Blood, I realized. My grandmother's blood, taken when the pact was made. I dumped the contents into the fire. The effect was instantaneous. The entity's form exploded outward, expanding and then collapsing in on itself like a dying star. The screams cut off. The unnatural cold vanished. For a moment, I saw my grandmother's true face, peaceful and relieved. Then she was gone, and the night was just a night again. Normal sounds returned. Distant traffic, sirens, the ordinary sounds of the city. I collapsed beside the drum, watching the last of the items burn to ash. My hands were blistered, my clothes torn and filthy with grave dirt. I desecrated a grave, destroyed property, and probably broken a dozen laws. But I was alive. The entity was gone, the curse broken, the debt paid in a way the demon had never anticipated. The sun rose over the city. I watched it, appreciating light in a way I never had before. My phone buzzed. My mother asking if I was okay, saying she'd had terrible nightmares all week, but they'd suddenly stopped. I told her I was fine, that everything was going to be okay now. And for the first time since the funeral, Primera Bilibed Italiano, I never told anyone the full truth of what happened. My mother thinks I was just dealing with grief in my own way. My friend thinks I had a temporary breakdown from stress. Let them believe what they want. I know the truth. I know what my grandmother carried with her from Brazil, what haunted me through those 6 nights of horror. And I know that some family secrets are better left buried. Some debts can only be paid in blood and fire. Some demons were the faces of those we love to get close enough to devour us. But I also know that even the darkest curse can be broken if you're willing to descend into the grave itself and drag the truth back into the light. Sometimes, late at night, I still wake suddenly, my heart racing. But when I turn on the light, there's nothing there. Just shadows being shadows and the quiet comfort of an ordinary room. The curse is broken. The entity is gone, and I am finally, truly free. My grandmother's grave was filled back in by cemetery maintenance, who assumed kids had vandalized it. No investigation was ever launched. The items are gone, reduced to ash, and scattered by the wind. The metal tin I threw into the river, watching it sink into dark water, taking its secrets with it. I visit my grandmother's grave sometimes now. I place flowers there, speaking to the woman she must have been before she made her desperate bargain. I forgive her for what she brought down on our family. I understand that desperation can drive us to make deals we never should make, with things that should remain in darkness. But I also made a promise to myself, standing over that grave in daylight. This curse dies with me. I will have no children to pass this legacy to. Whatever debt my grandmother incurred, whatever horror she unleashed, it ends here. The devourer claimed its last victim the night I burned those anchors to ash. Our bloodline ends clean, free of the shadow that has hung over it since my grandmother was young. And that, I think, is the only real ending to a story like this, not a return to normalcy. Because I'll never be truly normal again. How can you be, after seeing what lurks in the spaces between life and death? But a kind of peace, hard-won and precious. The peace of knowing that I broke the chain, that I stood in a cemetery at midnight and fought for my soul and won. The scars on my hands from the fire have faded now. The nightmares come less frequently. Life goes on, as it always does, but I remember. I remember every moment of those 6 nights. I remember the labored breathing, the twisted form, the cold that went beyond temperature into something metaphysical. I remember because forgetting would dishonor what I survived. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the night is very quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I wonder about the others. How many people has the devourer claimed over the centuries? How many families has it haunted, generation after generation? How many desperate souls made the same bargain my grandmother made, trading temporary relief for eternal horror? I'll never know. Those stories died with their victims, but my story didn't end that way. My story ends here, in the light of day, with the knowledge that even in our darkest moments, even when hell itself wears the face of family and comes calling in the night, we can choose to fight. We can choose to descend into the grave, to face what terrifies us, and to emerge victorious on the other side. That is my grandmother's real legacy. Not the curse, but the courage to break it. Not the demon, but the strength to send it screaming back into whatever abyss spawned it. She lived in fear of what she'd done. I refused to do the same. I broke the curse, shattered the chains, and reclaimed my life from the darkness. And that makes all the difference.